Masked with locks. He would find any pair of handcuffs or locks, and take them apart and put them back together again several times and figure out exactly how they work. So he was an amateur locksmith before he even became famous. So now I have these on, and now I'm going to attempt to take them off, to escape from them within 5 seconds. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yay! Yeah, it wasn't that impressive, was it? Houdini could also get out of any pair of handcuffs from his time period in 5 seconds. Any pair. Any lock he could get out of in 5 seconds. But Houdini was a much better showman than I am. He took this 5-second trick and turned it into a 50-minute extravaganza, a spectacle. He would start by asking someone from the audience, he'd invite people from the audience to bring handcuffs to the show. He'd ask someone, all right, bring a pair of handcuffs up, they'd come up, and he'd look at them and he'd shake his head, he'd be like, I don't know, I'm not sure I can get out of these. And he'd say, but I'm going to attempt it. Then his wife, who was also his assistant for many years, she'd come out, oh Harry, please don't try it. Those look like the cuffs you had so much trouble with. Oh Harry, you could hurt yourself. I know, but I have to try. The audience is expecting it. And so he'd have the handcuffs put on, and he'd shake his head and look at them and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure I can get out of these. And his wife would hug him and say, oh Harry. And he'd be like, it's fine, it's fine. She'd run off crying. He would make this whole big thing about these handcuffs. He's not sure he could get out. He would then bring out this rod, circle rod with curtains around, and he'd ask members of the audience to come up and say, examine this rod and these curtains. Make sure there's no hidden locks or picks or anything. And they'd examine it. He'd say, I give $1,000 to anyone that can find any lock or pick hidden in this curtain and rod. And they'd search it all over. You know, his money was perfectly safe because there was no picks or locks. And then he'd have the audience members who searched it just stand around the curtain there. He'd say, check, make sure there's no trapdoors, okay. And now I'm going to attempt to get out of these handcuffs. And he'd go in, it would be a low thing, so he'd fall down like that, and have the curtain close around him, and the orchestra would start playing, and the audience would get fidgety, and then he'd burst out, the handcuffs are still on. He'd say, I just want to see them in the light. I really don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have a glass of water, please? And his assistant would bring out a glass of water. The water wasn't for him to drink. It was so once he was in the curtain, he could take some and put some on his face to make it look like he was sweating. So he'd get back in with the glass, and he'd say something to the committee members who were standing around the curtain, the audience members. Examine this. If anyone can find a key or a lock in this glass of water, I'll give them $200. And of course, there was none in there, but they'd all search it, make sure it's clear glass. Yeah, okay, so he'd go back in, the curtain closed, and again, the orchestra would play, build up, and he'd come out again, still locked. And he'd ask the man who put the handcuffs on, could you just take them off for a minute just so I can take off my jacket? And the man would shake his head and said, no, not unless you admit defeat. So Houdini would reach in with his mouth into his top of his coat pocket and pull out a pocket knife, keep the pocket knife in his mouth, and then start shredding his coat jacket. Like that. I mean, his hands were like this. He could have easily just reached in and pulled it out, but it was more dramatic to put his mouth in there and grab it, the pocket knife by his mouth, start ripping his coat off. I mean, again, this is all show. He had like a whole trunk of these coats that would rip really easily with just the slightest touch of a knife. And so he'd rip it all apart, the coat would fall off, and then he'd spit out the knife onto the floor, and he'd get usually a standing ovation, but at least a large round of applause, and then go back under the curtain. But this time he'd take the glass of water and just dump it on his head so it looked like he was like dripping in sweat. Finally, after, he went on and on like this, after 50 minutes, he finally came out free of the handcuffs. Now again, he was out of the handcuffs in 5 seconds. It didn't take him nothing. But he was such a showman. And then the next day, all the newspapers would write about how he just barely made it out, and you must come to tonight's show, maybe tonight he won't make it out. It was just amazing how he could take a simple 5-second thing and turn it into, extravaganza or a spectacle that everybody in the audience remembered for the rest of their lives. That was Houdini, master showman. I became fascinated with Houdini when I was a young boy, and I bought a book on Houdini. He was just such a fascinating character, and I did magic tricks as well. And so I started stocking up and buying a whole bunch of Houdini's books. Here's just a few of my books. I have like about 30 Houdini books right now. It's amazing how many books there are on just one person. This is all from my collection. This is probably the definitive book. If you only get one book on Houdini, this one by Kenneth Silverman is the one to get. I also have at my home these 2 photos of Houdini. There here is he being put in a straitjacket. The other one is in a box being dumped into a river. These are actual photographs from Houdini's private collection that I bought at auction, and they're hanging on our wall at home. So it just shows you how much of a Houdini fanatic I am. Houdini grew up. His real name was Eric Weiss. He was born in Budapest, but his family, when he was young, moved to Appleton, Wisconsin, and then they moved to New York City. They were very, very poor. His father was a rabbi, but he had trouble getting work at any synagogues because he didn't speak English, and so he spoke German, so there was very few openings for German-speaking rabbis who wouldn't learn English. Houdini became a messenger boy. This is the first known photograph we have of Houdini. He's about 13 years old, and he worked as a messenger boy. All the children worked various jobs because they needed money just to eat. He was a very athletic Houdini. He ran a race in Central Park and won a medal for the race. You notice there's a lot of medals on him. He only won one, and then he borrowed all these others to put on him for the picture to make it look like he won a lot. Houdini had a huge ego, and again, he wanted to make everyone think he was the greatest at everything, and so one medal wasn't enough. He had to have a lot of medals. And he got into magic at a very young age, started performing magic, and eventually he went to Coney Island, which is on the beach in New York City. It's kind of the end of the pier kind of thing, but they had like sideshows like the fat bearded lady, the muscle man, the wolf man, and then magicians. And so they call them dime museums because you pay a dime to get in and see the magician perform. It was the lowest scale of entertainment. So that's how he got a start. This is the earliest photograph of him with his magic tricks. And there he met his wife, Bess, on Coney Island, New York. They married within 3 weeks of meeting each other, and she became his assistant. And they were married until his death. There's them performing one of their trunk substitution tricks. Again, they were really struggling. They were not famous right off the bat. They worked for a circus for a while. This is them with the Welch Brothers Circus. And it was during the circus that he really started getting into learning how to break into locks and take apart handcuffs and things. And he did magic mostly, and there's a few escapes, and then he met this theater producer, Martin Beck, who said, forget the magic, anyone can do magic. The escapes, that's what makes you unique. And so Houdini said, fine, and Martin Beck sent him over here to England, and he got his first tour, touring theaters as an escapologist. And this is an early photograph of him with all the handcuffs. Houdini, for publicity, he did nude escaping from the nude. Houdini wasn't shy, he was a bit of an exhibitionist. And he was very, very athletic, he didn't mind showing off his body. So there's a lot of photographs of him with little or no clothes on. In order to generate some publicity, he went to a jail, a local prison, I don't remember the town here, it's here in England, and he said, put me in a jail cell and I'll get out. And they said, yeah, right. He's like, no, really. So they put him in a jail cell, walked away, and within seconds he was already out. And they were amazed. And then they tried it again. They stripped him down, had a doctor examine him, put his clothes in one cell, him in the other, and then walked away. And again, within a minute, he was out fully dressed. He had gotten out of his own cell, got to the other cell, got his clothes, and came out. And very quickly. And this made all the newspapers, and so his shows started picking up, and Martin Beck moved him to, higher up on the scale, so he was just below the headliner now. And then he went to Scotland Yard. And he went to Scotland Yard, went up to them and said, put me in handcuffs, put me in a jail cell, whatever you want, I'll escape. And they just laughed him off. He said, no, really, do it. So they put one pair of handcuffs on his wrist, the other on a desk, around the leg of a desk. They said, right, we're going off to lunch, we'll be back in an hour to let you out. And they started walking away, and he said, no, I'll come join you. And they hear a clank, the handcuffs fell on the floor, and the Houdini walked and joined them, and Scotland Yard was amazed, obviously. And this made all the newspapers, and suddenly Houdini became a headliner. And he finally started making real money. more pictures of him naked, and he even had police put him in a straitjacket, and he got out of that. So now Houdini is a headliner. He becomes very famous. He'd come up with more and more weird escapes. He'd have people tie him like this to a rope and on the stage, a rope around a chair. Here's a giant wheel with chains and ropes that he got out of. And then he went back to America, but of course no one knew him in America. He was a failure there. So when he came back to America, he was advertised as a European sensation. Everyone thought he was from Europe, but he was from New York. And more chains. Houdini was always trying to top himself, always trying to do one better. This looks like a really difficult one here. He was an amazing man. Again, like I said, he had a huge ego, but and he was constantly working. He only slept like 3 or 4 hours a night every night because he's constantly working on new magic, new escapes, something more to top himself to get one better. That's a nice picture of him and his wife. And so he came up with this idea of a milk can. I can escape from a milk can. It was filled with water, as you can see. The lid was put on. Then his little curtain was put around it, and the audience members came up and surrounded the curtain to make sure nobody could help him. And he would get out. There's him getting ready to go in, and then his head about to go under. One time, at one of the shows, the audience, they put the curtain around the milk can, the orchestra stopped playing, the audience is getting nervous, and one of his assistants is nearby, and he hears this little ruffling, and he whispers to Houdini, "We can hear you turning your newspaper. You're ruffling too loud." So Houdini had been out already. He's sitting there reading the newspaper, trying to walk. The audience is sitting there. Houdini's response was, "Tell the orchestra to play louder." And so they did. And finally, then he comes out like he just got out, just in seconds before he drowned. And again, he wanted to top himself, so he started, when he would tour different cities, he would go to that city, find a lake or a river, and get handcuffed and jump in and then escape from the handcuffs in the running river or the ice-cold lake. And there's him about to jump in, close up. There's Bess right there next to him with the fancy hat, his wife, who was always there to help out. Again, nobody knew. She was his assistant in the early years, but in later years she was still helping him without anybody knowing it. And this brings us to his mother. Houdini was a real mama's boy. He loved his mother almost as much as his wife, maybe more. He just adored his mother. When she died, his whole life collapsed. He took 2 years off of touring, and he started going to spiritualist mediums to try to see if mediums could reach his mother from the beyond. And he suddenly realized these are all phonies, these are all fakes. They're just using magic tricks to fool people. So he started on a vendetta against spiritualist mediums, proving how they were fake, how they could make tables knock, how could they make trumpets float in the air, how they could, make voices come up. It was basically ventriloquism is all it was. And so he started exposing them on stage and became vigilant against them. They got to know Houdini after a while and know who he was, so they wouldn't let him into the seances. So he started wearing disguises. This is actually Houdini in one of his disguises going to a seance. And then once the seance began and something weird started happening, Houdini would immediately take a torch and shine it on them and show where they had the strings or whatever, and then say, "Aha, I'm Houdini, take that." And then he'd have photographers who we had waiting right outside jump in and take pictures of everything happening. Houdini liked the dramatic. And then he became friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes. They were a very mixed-matched pair, but they became really, really close friends. Until Sir Arthur Conan Doyle believed in mediums and believed in spiritualism and people could come back from the dead. So, Arthur Conan Doyle's second wife was a medium, and he kept asking Houdini, "Come, let my wife have a seance with you." And Houdini kept saying, "No, no, 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 no." He didn't want to ruin their friendship. Finally, he agreed, but he said, "Just the three of us, you, your wife, and me, and that's it." Houdini's wife didn't even attend. And so Conan Doyle's wife sat down at a table with a pad of paper, and she said, "Right, I'm going to contact your mother. She's here now, she's from heaven." And she puts a cross on the top of the paper. And then she starts writing, "My dear Harry, oh, it's so good to be in touch with you. I'm amazed Mrs. Doyle has helped us to have this happen." And Houdini just politely nodded. And then they said, "Well, thank you very much" at the end. That was interesting. But went to the papers the next day and just said it was all a phony, it was all a fake. And of course, Conan Doyle was really upset. Houdini was basically calling his wife a liar. But I mean, Houdini knew it couldn't have been his mother. First of all, the cross at the top of the paper, Houdini's mother was Jewish. Houdini's father was a rabbi, so... and then his mother started writing in English. His mother never learned how to write in English. She barely knew any English except for simple words. She spoke German. And she called him Harry. Houdini's name was Eric Weiss. Harry was his stage name. She would have called him Eric. And there was just one thing after another. There was like 20 things that she got wrong that proved it couldn't have been his mother. So that was the end of him and Conan Doyle's friendship. Most magicians make a rabbit disappear. Houdini made a live elephant disappear on the stage at Hippodrome Theater in New York City. It was the only stage where he could do this stunt because it was the only stage that could hold the weight of an elephant. But he did that for about 6 weeks. Every night he made an elephant disappear right on the stage. It was amazing. And then he came up with the idea of the water torture cell. This is very famous, what he's known as. It's a little bit more difficult than the milk can. He's actually upside down in water, so he really can only breathe a certain amount of time before he would drown. And he was about to go in, he's about to be lowered in, and within about 5 minutes he escaped it. So what he'd have to do for the water torture cell, sometimes he'd have a giant clock. He'd say, "How long can you hold your breath, audience members?" Everyone hold their breath when I go under the water. And they'd go under, the clock would start, and they'd all hold their breath after 30 seconds, 40 seconds, they'd all go, "Ah." And yet Houdini was still, under there. And they put the curtain around, and finally he'd escape and get out. Many people think Houdini died in the water torture cell because they did a Houdini movie with Tony Curtis where he died in it. He didn't. He didn't die in the water torture cell. This is one of the last known pictures of Houdini. Houdini died of appendicitis. He was starting having pains that day, so he already had appendicitis. And then later that day, a student came up to him and said, "I heard you could take a punch, right in the gut." And Houdini's like, yeah. The student just went like, boom, punched him a few times. And Houdini's like, wait, I gotta prepare myself. So Houdini, okay, now I'm prepared. And then he punched him and said, "See, I can take it." But apparently one of the punches ruptured his already inflamed appendix. And Houdini tried to continue it on, did a show that night, did a couple more shows, but eventually in Detroit, he died from burst appendix. On Halloween night. And he was buried in New York, and that's me at his grave. He's just an amazing man, escapologist, magician, but mainly a master showman. Thank you.